Chapter 32, Section 3. So let's talk in this section about the French Revolution. So the old monarchies of France in the 1600s and the 1700s, these were divine right monarchies. Kind of all powerful, kind of the idea that our rule comes from God and you have to listen to us. Well, there are three estates or classes to French society at this time. The first estate was the clergy. Less than 1% of people belonged to the first estate, but the first estate owned 10% of all of the land in France. The first estate did not have to pay taxes. They received income, though, from the church lands, but it wasn't divided evenly. Most went to the high church officials who would wear these purple and scarlet velvet robes with lace and fancy. The parish priests, the local priests, they lived very simple lives. So that's the first estate. The second estate was the nobility. This ends up being about 2% of the people. They owned large areas of land. They, as well, don't pay taxes. They lived off of grants from the royal treasury and peasants' rent that they paid. They spent their time dancing and hunting and gambling. Some of them fill very high government and military posts. Then you have the third estate. The third estate is everybody else in France. And there kind of was a ranking within the third estate. So in the third estate, the top part of the third estate was the bourgeoisie. These were bankers or merchants, lawyers, doctors, manufacturers, teachers, stuff like that. They controlled a lot of the wealth and trade. The middle part of the third estate was city workers. These were artisans, day laborers, servants, people like that. And then at the bottom of the third estate were the peasants. 80% of France's people fell into this peasant class, part of the third estate. The third estate had no power in the government. The third estate, as you might have noticed, is the only estate paying taxes because the first and second didn't have to pay taxes. The third estate's paying income tax, they're paying property tax, they're paying land tax and crop tax and sales tax. If you had a child that was born, you had to pay a child tax when they were born. And never mind that the fact that they had to pay their feudal dues as well. By the time you get to the 1780s, though, the French government was in trouble. French writers and thinkers, philosophers, they wrote articles pointing out all the political problems in France. François-Marie Arouet, nobody called him that. He was just called Voltaire. He wrote about this idea of free speech, free press, freedom of religion, equal justice. Just because you're in one of the other states doesn't mean you should get away with crimes. One of the major problems in France was going to be the fact that they were broke. They were broke. They spent most of their money actually helping out the United States in the American Revolution. And so King Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette, are ruling now. They're ruling a broke France. But they spent a ton of money just on not needed things, just luxuries. She was actually nicknamed Madame Deficit because she spent so much money she increased the deficit or the national debt of France. The king, he thinks that the nobles and the clergy, that first and second estate, he thinks they should start paying taxes. But they had never had to pay taxes before. And if you ask them, they weren't going to start paying them now either. So Louis XVI is going to call for a meeting of the French legislature. I mean, he has to decide how to raise more money. They're broke. The French legislature was called the Estates General. The Estates General had not met since 1614 was the last time they had met. And in the past, the way it worked was each estate got one vote. So the clergy got a vote, the nobles got a vote, and the third estate got a vote. The third estate, even though that was like 97% of the people, always lost. It was always 2-1. The third estate says, hey, why don't we get a larger voice in this? They want the Estates General to meet as one group, and each member gets one vote, not each group, not each estate. They want their number of representatives to equal the other two put together, since they're most of the people. So in May of 1789, the Estates General meets. And the third estate is given more representatives. But what that means is the other two estates, they actually refused to meet as part of this. The third estate met with a small number of priests and nobles. And it's going to be called the National Assembly. Louis XVI threatened to break up the National Assembly. They swore that they weren't going to break up. They said, we won't break up till there is going to be a written constitution for France. So the Estates General can't meet because they won't. The first and second won't meet with the third. The National Assembly's meeting, which is mostly the third, with a few representatives from the first and second. And so Louis XVI is going to order the first and second estate to meet with the National Assembly. He orders them, they have to. What you end up with is uprisings throughout most of France. You know, France had high hopes when the Estates General was meeting. But eventually people feared nothing was going to improve. You know, harvests were poor right now. Food was scarce and expensive. I mean, to buy a loaf of bread cost more than a whole day's pay. The winter was cold. You know, people had water in front of their fireplaces that still froze. It was so cold. Hundreds of thousands of city workers were unemployed. And you start to see mobs forming in France. Which brings us to July 14th, 1789. These mobs are going to attack and capture the Bastille. The Bastille was this old fort that was used as a prison. The mob attacks the Bastille because the mob was looking for weapons. And the Bastille was just this symbol of tyranny, this unjust use of power. The mob is going to kill the mayor of Paris and set up a new city government. News of Paris spreads. People they start hearing about what happened in Paris, and rumors start to spread. Rumors like nobles were going to hire brigands, these roving bandits, and supposedly they were going to destroy peasants' homes. Well, the peasants weren't going to stand by and wait for that, so the peasants attack and burn the nobles' homes. And one thing they destroy is they destroy all the feudal records. So now all of a sudden you don't know who owes what with what land. Things are changing in France.